Hello, fellow peacemakers. It's Lily. Happy belated New Year. I know it's been eons since I last recorded an episode, and for those who are still subscribed to the podcast, you were probably surprised to have received a notification earlier today on your phone saying that Make Peace Not Beef released a new episode. Yes, I am still alive. You were probably wondering where I went for the past 7 months. Well, the reason why I've been absent is because I actually started my master's back in September 2022, and for those of you who don't know, I'm doing a master's in public policy, and I moved countries actually. So I moved from Toronto, Canada to Cambridge, Massachusetts in the States. And I've just been so occupied with the transition, being uprooted, being a student again, building relationships with classmates and professors, studying, writing exams, networking, going to events and whatnot. It's been really overwhelming, not gonna lie. So that definitely took priority in my life, and I really haven't had the time to podcast. But I really missed being in front of the mic, and I've missed talking to all of you. I don't know if I'll be able to podcast regularly from now on, but, I'll do it whenever I have the opportunity. Anyway, today I'm back for a special episode to tell you about my recent trip to Africa during the winter break, which was absolutely mind-blowing, eye-opening, breathtaking, jaw-dropping, heart-stopping. Did I name all the organs? And basically, it was beyond anything I could have ever conceived. And this was my first time in Africa, and it turned out to be the most unforgettable trip I've had up to date. First of all, I just want to recognize that I am extremely privileged to be able to travel to a part of the world that so many can only dream of. So I record this episode with ample gratitude, and I count my blessings. So today I want to share with you where I went, what I did, what I saw and experienced on this trip, because a lot of you guys have been asking me about it, like especially my family and friends. So I was kind of hoping that, if I record this episode, I can just send it out to everybody so I don't have to repeatedly tell the same story. But I also want to talk about why this trip was so meaningful for me, my key takeaways, insights, and revelations. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. So a bit of a backstory of how I decided to go on this trip. So back in 2020, shortly after I first became vegan, I discovered Colleen Patrick Goudreau. Now, many of you may have heard of her, but she's a well-respected author and educator in the vegan community who has published several books and hosts a podcast of her own. She's extremely knowledgeable, rational, and eloquent. And actually, I read her book, The Joyful Vegan, 2 years ago during the pandemic at the beginning of my journey as a vegan. Anyway, her book profoundly shaped my perspective and my approach to veganism. Later, I found out Colleen was partnering with a travel agency called World Vegan Travel, and they were doing vegan trips around the world to different destinations in Europe and also in parts of Africa. I desperately wanted to meet Colleen and go on one of these trips with her and exchange with her my thoughts on veganism and whatnot. And I saw she was organizing a trip to Botswana with a focus on learning about nature and wildlife. And I've never been to Africa, never experienced a safari. I'm a city girl who grew up in big cities all her life. You guys probably heard it in a previous episode. I was born in Beijing. I was raised there. And then I came to Toronto when I was 11. So yeah, I've never lived anywhere remotely close to nature, sadly. So I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to step outside of my comfort zone and my sheltered bubbled life, and broaden my horizons and gain an appreciation for animals and nature in the wild, literally. So I signed up for the trip on a whim, not knowing what to expect at all from this trip, and truth to be told, I was actually more excited about meeting Colleen than the trip itself. Now, fast forward. A few weeks after I signed up, sadly, I was told that there was no space left on the trip with Colleen. And instead, the trip organizers suggested me to switch to another one of their trips to Botswana with the same route, except it's led by a wildlife photographer, Jennifer Hadley. Shout out to Jennifer. At first I was disappointed to say the least that I wasn't going to be on the trip with Colleen. But eventually, I said, okay, why not? Botswana seems amazing and it seemed like a once in a lifetime destination, so I'll go. So then I signed up for this trip in March 2021. The trip was slated to take place December 2021. However, because of COVID, it had to be postponed by a whole year to December 2022. So I was quite annoyed at that. Not at the trip organizers, of course, but just the fact that it had to be postponed by a whole year because I was planning to go on this trip while I still had a job at my old company. I was like, no, but I don't want to be going on this trip like in the middle of grad school. But anyway, that's what ended up happening. So I waited a year and a half for this trip. So as you can see, I was ambushed by not only one unexpected turn of events, but two. First, I couldn't meet Colleen on the trip. Second, the trip was delayed by a whole year. But that's just life, right? So quite frankly, leading up to the trip, I wasn't overly enthused or counting down the days because I simply didn't know what to expect. And little did I know I was in for a life-changing adventure. On Christmas Day, December 25th, 2022, after having spent Christmas with my parents, I took a flight from Toronto to Cape Town, South Africa, via Amsterdam. It was a 20-hour something trajectory in total, and even though I was getting increasingly tired, as the plane was descending into Cape Town, I could suddenly feel the anticipation climb as I felt this adrenaline rush. I remember thinking, this is it. I'm about to set foot in Africa. This is the continent where life began. And the moment I landed in South Africa, it just felt surreal. The next morning, my first day in Cape Town, I woke up to a spectacular view of the monumental Table Mountain that was partially shrouded in cloud. I decided to venture out for a morning walk and explore the neighborhood. The city is mountainous and has a notable z-axis, which means it's very hilly, has a lot of inclines, and parts of it reminiscent of, almost San Francisco's topography, with familiar sights of palm trees and whatnot. But instead of seeing Spanish architecture everywhere, as you would in the Bay Area, you would expect to see heavy Dutch and British influence in Cape Town, which are, remnants of colonialism. So I saw a lot of street signs in Afrikaans, which is also coined as Baby Dutch. It's one of the primary languages spoken there, other ones being Zulu and Xhosa, and I can't do the click. That's the language that Trevor Noah speaks. By the way, I saw a ton of Trevor Noah posters in South Africa, so that confirmed his popularity not only in North America, but also in Cape Town. But anyway, I digress. What I noticed was Cape Town is extremely ethnically diverse and mixed, with heavy European influences embedded everywhere in the city, unsurprisingly, due to its history. I'd say it's majority black, but there's a sizable population of Caucasians and also Colorettes, which are populations of mixed descent, and they all live in harmony today after 50 years of apartheid. So in Cape Town at the guest house I was staying, I met with the trip organizers, Seb and Bridie, who are absolutely fantastic. Shout out to Seb and Bridie. And also all the other travelers who would be headed to Botswana with me later. Shout out to any of you lovely people if you're listening to my podcast. In no time, we would bond and share countless precious memories together, but at the time, we were still strangers warming up to one another. So, after resting for a day in Cape Town, the next day we got up at 5 a.m. That's right, you heard me correctly. 5 a.m. as we got ready to board a plane to fly to Mon, Botswana. In my opinion, this was the turning point because this was where the adventure really began for me. So a quick note about Botswana. Botswana is a country in southern sub-Saharan Africa located immediately to the north of South Africa. The country is extremely rich in biodiversity, known for its Kalahari Desert and the Okavango Delta, which I will speak about in a minute. The country is highly protected with limited tourism, meaning the government actually limits the number of visitors into the country per year as to preserve the country's natural wonders and to ensure minimum human impact. It's probably one of the last places on the planet that is largely untouched by humans, so yes, in retrospect, I was extremely lucky and privileged to be able to visit it. So, First, we flew from Cape Town to Mon, a city in Botswana, which was about a 2-hour flight. Then once in Mon, we then took a baby plane, or a safari plane as we called it, to fly into the heart of Toby National Park, into the heart of nature, where our campsite was located. So the duration of the baby plane was about 30 minutes, and the baby plane had only about 10 seats. It was really small. You could feel the turbulences more, and it flies at a much lower altitude compared to conventional planes. So the entire flight, you get a nice, clear bird's eye view of the landscape below. Now, peering down from inside the plane, I saw miles of stretches of greenery and vegetation with not a single person inside, and it was just incredible. So when we got off Safari Air, the first thing I noticed was the weather and the desert climate. It was scorching hot at around 34 degrees Celsius. For American listeners who are listening, I am sorry, I'm not going to do the conversion. I still operate on the metric system because I'm Canadian, so I am excused. But anyway, recall that just 2 days ago, I was in Toronto and the weather was about, 0 degrees Celsius. So I went straight from winter to summer, basically. So we immediately hopped into safari vehicles and began our very first game drive as we were headed to our first camp, Camp Savuti. The local guide who was driving the vehicle told us we may expect to see some animals on the way to our camp. One thing to note is that we all sat in open vehicles, which means that there was no windows and no protection and whatnot. A lot of my friends asked me if I was scared. You bet I was scared. I was terrified at the thought of open vehicles because my greatest concern at the time was, well, what if a hungry lion, decides that I would make a delicious lunch and just decides to pounce on me? The trip organizers reassured me multiple times prior to the trip, and later the guys as well, that the animals in the area are so used to the sight of safari vehicles that they won't even bat an eye in our presence. In addition, I was told that the lion perceives the entire safari vehicle as one giant creature, provided that no human is stupid enough to hop out of the vehicle. Still, I was not convinced. My life was on the line. But what can I do? I was already in Botswana. It's too late now. So, as the vehicle picked up speed, I could feel the cool, fresh breeze brushing against my skin, and it was the most miraculous sensation ever. My eyes were busy scanning my surroundings, trying to capture it all, the sight, the scent, the sensation of the wind, the smell of lush flora, everything. I saw mostly grassy plains, sand belts, low-lying plants, and scrub savanna. There were hardly any tall trees. It was very much desert-like in terms of the condition. And there was a ton of dead trees. So you see these trees with branches but no leaves. And they were almost sculpture-like in their structure. It was super cool. And I've never been in a place with similar geography my entire life. It felt so desolate. It felt like one of those desert photography moments. It felt like I ended up in a different world, on a different planet somehow. Then, right there and then, it hit me. I suddenly saw a giant elephant striding in the distance, coming out of the bushes. That's when my jaw dropped. I was astonished and near tears. Maybe I did shed a few tears. I don't really remember. I could not believe how magnificent and surreal it was. Sure, it's not the first time I've seen an elephant in my life, but it was the first time I've seen one in the wild. And I promise you, I guarantee you, it is nothing like the zoo. It is nothing like the zoo. It's not even comparable. It took me straight back to prehistoric times. I felt as if I was tracing the footsteps of one of my hunter-gatherer ancestors from hundreds of thousands of years ago. Then I saw a few giraffes walking over to the safari vehicle, and they were elegant and gentle-natured creatures and much taller than I had imagined. We stopped for a minute to observe these gorgeous animals up close, and they stared right back at us with curious eyes, and they just posed right there, not at all under any perceived danger or threat, but rather it felt as if they were greeting us into their world in their own way. And after that, we spotted some zebras, and they were so cute. Apparently, zebra stripes protect them from their predators when they're in a herd, so that the predators wouldn't be able to distinguish them from one another. Clever, right? Nature's inventions. Then afterwards, we spotted a herds of impalas. Like, we really lucked out on our first day. We saw basically like 90% of the animals. So we spotted this herd of impalas, and impalas were the most consistent because you could easily spot them almost everywhere on the safari. These animals are super, super cute, but don't be fooled. When chased by a predator such as a cheetah, they can run up to 90 kilometers an hour. They are extremely fast, one of the fastest animals on the planet. Finally, we reached to the camp in the middle of nature. It was a beautiful lodge constructed with individual huts and a common area for dining. The common area overlooks a waterhole, and during dinner at sunset, against the vermilion sky, we saw a family of elephants coming by the waterhole by the camp to drink water. It was the most spectacular view ever. I saw baby elephants following their doting mothers, and even though as humans, we don't speak the same language as elephants, I could nevertheless recognize their familiar gestures and their body language. The way the mother cared and nursed for the young, sometimes caressing them with her trunk, the way she protected her kids, that maternal instinct is a common language that we can very well relate to as humans. And watching the elephants interact with one another was not only touching but heartwarming, and I felt more close to these animals than ever. The guides and the camp staff instructed us to not walk around the camp by ourselves before dawn and after dusk when it's dark, because it could get dangerous. And wild animals such as leopards have been spotted on the campsite before, so every day we had to be escorted to breakfast and also escorted back to our individual huts after dinner. Now, I've never been escorted in my entire life, so I felt very important during those few days at the camp. Because there were no locks on the doors, since all the doors were sliding doors at the camp, we were told to shut the doors at night to prevent animals from coming in. Now, at night, it could get a little scary. I'm not gonna lie. I was showering in my room and I could literally hear the elephants trumpeting outside and water splashing. It was wild. So over the next few days, every morning, we would get up at 5 a.m. to go for game drives on the reserves. One of the days, I got up extra early at 4:30 a.m. to be in the photography vehicle with Jennifer, our in-house wildlife photographer, to learn more about her craft and photography. The photography vehicle leaves earlier because the lighting is radically different at 4 a.m. versus 5 a.m. versus 6 a.m. So if you want to capture the golden light at dawn, you have to wake up early. Moreover, animals tend to wake up early, so if you sleep in and you get up at 9 a.m., you probably will miss the golden opportunity. And unlike a zoo, the whole experience of a game drive feels like playing detective. You have to look for the animals everywhere you go, very attentively, because you never know where they're hiding and when they will appear. And that was kind of, part of the game and the excitement of a game drive. Right? Not knowing what to expect. Whereas a zoo, okay, I'm going to see the elephants next. I'm going to see the lions next. In nature, there's no such thing as that. You never know what to expect. So you have to be on the lookout. Anyway, I was duly rewarded for my early departure because that morning I saw lions roar on the savannah and marking their territory. It was just incredible. I saw a male lion approaching a female lion, and the two of them just kind of quietly sat there on the savannah and looked into the distance as they kept each other company, as if they were an old couple too familiar with the ways of the world. Now, needless to say, at that moment, I was playing Lion King's theme song right in my head. Yup, cute Elton John. I also learned from the guide that in a lion pride, it is the female that does all the hunting, and the male actually stays back home with his cubs to protect them. That's something I didn't know before. I thought it was the male that did the hunting. This is because, physiologically speaking, the female is much leaner, so she can chase the prey with more ease, and her lack of mane makes it easier for her to camouflage. Now, later on the drive, I saw impalas playing with one another, chasing one another, and roaming the open plains at full speed, and that was just an incredible sight I could not describe. I felt like I was watching an episode of Planet Earth, except there was no David Attenborough's narration, and I was actually there in person to witness the wonders of wildlife, which was even better. Now, that's not something you can ever see in a zoo because there's simply no space for them to roam. And In that moment, I marveled at their existence, and I was convinced that animals truly belonged in the wild and not confined in a zoo. I saw how these animals behaved drastically differently in the wild. The way the elephants stomp, impalas roam, lions roar and hunt, birds spread their wings and fly. I've never seen animals so free and carefree in their element. Whereas in the zoo, these animals often suffer from chronic depression, from constantly being closed in a cramped and artificially constructed space with their movement encumbered. They lose a lion's share, pun intended, of their animalistic nature and instinct, including their perceptiveness, ability to sense their surroundings and engage with nature, their ability to hunt and chase and escape their predator, attract the opposite sex. When they're kept in a zoo long enough, they slowly lose touch with nature, and they lose touch with themselves and who they are at its core. And in that moment, I reflected long and hard on the dilemma between keeping animals in captivity in a zoo versus letting them stay in the wild where they really belong. It's tough because a visit to the zoo is an excellent form of animal education for many, especially for children and young kids. The zoo is often when they first come into close contact with animals and learn about them and appreciate them. So I was thinking perhaps there should be a rotation policy where all animals should only be kept in the zoo for a certain amount of time, let's say 2 years, before they have to be released back into the wild. So after staying for 3 days at Camp Savuti, we then boarded another baby safari plane and headed over to Camp Okavango, which is located in the Okavango Delta of Botswana, which is a swampy basin defined by a network of water canals and riverbeds. I believe it's pronounced canal, actually. I don't know. Okay, excuse my English pronunciation. Moving on. So, our first camp, Camp Savuti's terrain, was home to land animals, and Camp Okavango was home to aquatic animals. And at the second camp, we had primarily water activities, such as canoeing and boat rides. The guide, extremely knowledgeable and as always, explained to us the history of the Okavango Delta and how the basin was formed. As for the camp itself, this time it was deeply embedded in the canopy, like I was in the jungle, even more so than the first camp. The distance between each of the huts is even further, and once again, we had escorts before and after the sunsets. On this camp, I saw snakes and frogs and baboons at the campsite. I remember one night I was coming back from our activities after sunset, and I suddenly saw a bunch of baboons literally in the walkway. And they leaped onto the trees at lightning speed, and the trees were all shaking. I was terrified, I'm not gonna lie. Also, different from the first camp, this camp had doors with locks, because I was told if you don't lock your doors, don't be surprised to find a baboon in your room when you come back. And baboons are pretty damn aggressive animals. Also, another thing I didn't know, because I did not read the instruction manual prior to coming to Botswana, but sleeping in the jungle is not as glorious as it seems in fantasy novels. It's extremely noisy at night. When it was 11 p.m., I was lying in bed. I was ready to go to sleep. But nope, there were still 1,000 birds right outside my room performing a symphony, or rather a cacophony. And then a few hours later, I heard baboons knocking on my door. This is way past midnight. And they were jumping up and down on my roof. Yeah, it's pretty damn scary. I'm not gonna lie. And somehow I survived the whole process, so I'm very proud of myself. I think I just closed my eyes and told myself, everything's going to be okay. I signed up for this. This is part of the experience. And of course, at some point, I also saw the classic, a giant black spider in my bathroom at some point. I've never seen a spider that big. But then again, I told myself, okay, Lily, you are the intruder this time, not them. You're in the jungle. This is the home of the animals, so get used to it. So during the day, we went on boat rides, and on the rides, we saw hippos, lizards, crocodiles, aquatic birds, the beautiful Malachite kingfisher that apparently migrates between Europe and Africa every year. That's a frequent flyer right there. They should get air miles. Once again, it was beyond surreal. I felt like I was on this extended biology field trip, and all these diagrams of all these animals I've ever seen in textbook suddenly materialized in life form. It was breathtaking. And I remember so clearly, specifically the afternoon of New Year's Eve. It was December 31st. It was the perfect weather. The sky was so blue without a single cloud that in the distance it gave the illusion of a vast, vast ocean. I was sitting on a canoe in the most serene river that was lined with golden papyrus that danced gently in the wind and water lilies that bobbed up and down on the surface of the water with each ripple. The temperature was just perfect and soothing. It was not too hot, not too cold, and at that moment I questioned if this was all a dream, or if I had died and ended up in paradise, because everything about that place felt like nirvana. It was heaven on earth, and it was too good to be true. I tried so hard to grasp every second and every detail before it slips through my fingers, but in that moment, I was in paradise, and I just wanted time to stop. The day after, we did a walking safari, which means this time we were not in a vehicle. That's right, we were walking through the bushes. This time, the guide brought a rifle with him, which thankfully he never had to use in 16 years. It was just in case an animal decides to charge us. Thankfully, that did not happen. And on the walking safari, we saw lizards, we saw baby warhawks, impalas, and mongoose. It was super fun. We also saw leopard tracks, but sadly no leopards, or maybe luckily, I don't know. Leopards are extremely stealthy animals, and most of the time you won't be able to spot them. They camouflage very, very well. So that's a brief summary of all the animals I've seen and all the activities we've done on this trip. But of course there was so much more, but I'll spare you the details. But let me just tell you a little bit about the people, because they were an essential part of the trip, and definitely one of the highlights. First of all, let me start with the people of Botswana. The camp staff, the guides, were some of the kindest and most inviting and welcoming people I've ever met in my life. You know, at the same time, they're incredibly hardworking. Every morning, I see the staff would wake up before the sun rises. They would sweep the floors of the walkways until it's squeaky clean, and they perform their daily prayers and rituals as a group. And then the staff would come and collect our dirty laundry, hand wash them with care, then fold them neatly on our bed upon our return at the end of the day. As for the guides, they were extremely knowledgeable. The guides were able to steer the vehicle and spot animals at the same time, neither of which I could do, and they could tell that there were predators nearby just by hearing the bird calls, and they could identify over hundreds of species of animals as well as plants. I was extremely privileged to be able to learn so much from them on our game drives. Every night when we have dinner, right before dinner served, the whole kitchen staff would line up at the front and sing for us these songs. Then, on the last night at each camp, they would have a whole performance for us, singing about their sadness upon our departure and bidding us goodbye. The first few days, not gonna lie, I thought the singing during dinner was kind of silly. Like, why do we need to sing about dinner? You know, I didn't really get it. But on the last night at the second camp, especially at Camp Okavango, hearing them singing goodbye to all of us really brought me to tears. And I realized it was not just me, because I looked around the table and there was not a single dry eye in the room. Every one of us was so touched by their singing and dancing, because we could feel that they poured their hearts and soul into it. And that really did touch something really deep in every one of us. The people of Botswana had this childlike innocence to them that is almost lost in most parts of the world. Seeing how genuine they were and how their hearts were soulful reminded me of what we're capable of as humans if we open our hearts up. And just for a brief second, I thought about the politics back home in the U.S., the filibustering that goes on in the Congress, the misinformation campaigns, the mistrust in the government, Trump, elections, etc., etc. And here I was, sheltered in a faraway bubble, free from all of humanity's nefarious acts, almost on a different planet, in a different era, living in a utopia where humans love each other and live in perfect harmony. Those days at the camp felt like a dream, and it was invigorating to be in that environment. It felt sacred. Now, right before boarding the plane to leave Botswana back to Cape Town, the camp staff shook hands with every one of us and thanked us. and I thank them in return for everything they've taught us and everything they've allowed us to experience by sharing their expertise openly with us. I could not stop crying in that moment. I don't know why. And I'm not someone who cries often. Not at all. I rarely cry. And I've actually never cried on a trip. So that was a first. But in that moment, I was truly really sad to leave this beautiful country, these incredible animals, nature, these people with hearts of gold, and even the baboons that terrified me at night. I knew I was going to miss them. Well, I don't want to see them again, but I still miss them in my heart. And I thought long and hard about all the things I've seen and learned on this trip. This trip was not just a vacation. Far from it, it was an open classroom. To learn about animals and nature, and to remind ourselves that as humans, we are not separate from nature, but part of it, and that we make up this beautiful, rich, complex, and biodiverse fabric that is called the ecosystem. So this trip to Africa, and especially Botswana, was the biggest dose of motivation for me to continue to pursue my career to solve for climate change, so that we can preserve nature, animals, the planet for future generations, so that we can build a sustainable future together and coexist peacefully on this planet. At the end of this trip, I have also forged deep friendships with people I've met on this trip. Now, shout out to Allie and Sharon, Jane and Kimberly, if you're ever listening to this podcast, and of course also Karen, Jenny, and plenty of others that I will not name because I don't have the time to. But obviously, a big thank you, Seb and Bridie, who arranged everything on this trip so that we can just relax and have the greatest time of our life. I'd love to visit you all someday, and give me a shout if you're ever in Boston or wherever I will be by the time you listen to this podcast. Hopefully someday. Now that the trip is over, I'm back in school, back to reality. In fact, right now I am back in my little house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and as I am recording this episode, the new semester is going to start in exactly 2 days. In 2 days. So in no time, I will be back in the classroom with my classmates, professors, back in the library at HKS, writing assignments and exams. It will seem as though I will have returned to my old life and nothing has changed. Yet, at the same time, I know something deep down within me has changed permanently. Even if I'm repeating the same routine, I know I am no longer the same person after this trip. I still have daily flashbacks of memories from the trip. And sometimes when I close my eyes at night, when I'm lying on my bed, I find myself transported right back to Botswana, in the wild, on the savannah, observing lions, elephants, impalas from a distance. After having been on the safari and seeing those animals with my own eyes, and seeing how free and blissful they were in their natural habitat, I have a newfound drive to tackle climate change, a renewed sense of purpose. I feel fresh, sharp, inspired, and motivated. And I'm going to work hard to make it happen. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I hope you have enjoyed it. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or thoughts regarding Botswana, Africa, my trip, or anything else you want to discuss with me, feel free to email me at, now I'm going to give you my personal email because I canceled the one for Make Peace Not Beef because I don't use the domain enough to justify me to keep paying for it. But you can email me at lilylilytong@gmail.com. That is my personal email, Lily spelled 2 L's. So I look forward to hearing from you, and in the meanwhile, I wish you all a great year ahead, a year full of happiness, health, and achievements. I'll see you in a future episode. Peace.